Welcome to Surviving Society.
Hi everyone and welcome back. I am here today with one of my loves, whose name is Katharine Yates. Katharine is an amazing facilitator, coach, human, mother, partner, friend, everything. Katharine is someone that I've known for quite a while. We tried to trace it back the other day. It's about 9 years we've got, which is crazy. We met through kind of a work capacity and have developed our relationship outside of that. And yeah, Katharine to me is someone that really embodies love and challenges my own understanding of an experience of love, which we'll get into a little bit more in this episode. Hi, Katharine.
Hi.
Have I missed anything? Is there anything else you would introduce yourself as?
No, I think you got it. That was a lovely introduction. Thank you.
Brilliant. And why I wanted to bring Katharine on for this conversation is, like I've mentioned, we met in a work capacity quite a while ago. I will share a little bit about my experience and then you can share what your experience of that was. And we met in a work capacity. My experience was I was working at a job that was getting quite tense. There was quite a bit of challenge and conflict for different reasons in terms of the role that I was doing and some of the roles that other people within that organisation were doing. And so we were about to deliver on, and I was working mainly with young women. No, I was working exclusively with young women, and a lot of those young women that had experienced quite challenging environments. We were about to run like a piece of work that involved, it was meant to be residential, but it moved. So we were about to run a piece of work that was bringing young women together to explore themselves in relation to conflict. I met Katharine in passing, but I was running this work with Katharine. Someone else, I believe, was meant to be running it with us. Yeah, we were kind of putting a room together to start planning this work. And on that first day, I remember carrying so much like questions, discomfort, just stories that I had about who Katharine was, about the role that Katharine was in within that organisation in comparison to me. And we kind of just got it out on the first day. So like, rather than talking about the work, we kind of were just like, right, there's elephants in the room, multiple, can we name them? And that was the kind of start of our relationship, and we went deep. It's my experience. We went into a lot, even though it started with like it started with the professional. We went quite quickly into the personal, and that actually these are the assumptions that I have about you. These are the ways that may prevent me from being fully present in this work. And yeah, that I think is the foundation that has kind of allowed for the depth of challenge and growth that we've had over the last almost decade.
I was thinking about it this morning, and I was remembering how I think we both came from such different places. There were so many things at that point in time when we came together to work on that project that separated us. There were identities really obviously as a black woman and a white woman. There were our roles within the organisation at the time. There was just the not knowing each other, and as you said, the stories we had about one another. And I really, and I remember really feeling that acutely and feeling like, oh my goodness, there's this gulf, and how do we work together? How do we bridge that so we can offer something to these young women from a place of connection and authenticity, and not from we've got to do a job. And yeah, I just remember that really, really clearly. And it was kind of out of necessity almost, of like, there's so much that's here. As you say, we had to name it. We had to put it on the table, and not just name what was there, but name what was behind what was there. And I remember sharing with you like really, really personal, vulnerable things about my identity and about my experience of living in the Caribbean and all this stuff that just came tumbling out. And you also, and that just provided a kind of a base, I feel, a ground from which we've developed ever since.
Yeah. You said that we had to put it all on the table, which I agree with, but actually isn't my experience of this work and the sector at large. I actually think most people in social justice spaces, most people in kind of work that is the kind of work that we've done, don't tend to put things all on the table. And so actually a challenge that I've had is that I'm often working with people that I don't trust, that I don't know, that I have multiple assumptions about and feel that they have that about me. And the quote unquote, I'm doing air quotations here, the work is prioritized and there isn't the time and the space to do that actual connection piece, which to me really limits the quality of the work that one can produce. And so when I think about that, even that, I'll be honest, I don't think that the organisation that we were working with at the time, even though in theory that's what they were commissioning us to do, the way that the organisation was running in practice at the time didn't allow for a lot of space for us to kind of engage in that way and to get through, to kind of build that depth, build that base that you've mentioned. But I think there is something about both of our personal commitments to working in a way that centres connection, and that's working in that way that allowed for that to happen.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because I hadn't thought of that. Maybe it was the combination of both of us meeting in that particular place at that particular time in that particular context of the organisation with our personalities that had that happen. Because it's true, I've also worked with people not from a place of connection, or certainly not the depth that we worked from on that project. But there was something in both of us that for me felt like, well, we need this, otherwise this is not going to be possible.
And one of those main things for me, I'll admit, was frustration. And like, I was just so pissed off. And I think actually this was like, it's looking back now, it's only in this moment I'm thinking that period of work, so about 10 years ago, when I was younger and more bright-eyed and had more faith in the charity sector, and I was coming against all of these hurdles. I was having all of these experiences that didn't feel loving, that didn't feel like, oh, what are we like? Yeah, it didn't feel like they were energetically, culturally meeting the aims that they were saying that they wanted to, or a lot of the organisations I was in and around. And I was getting to the point, it was about 10 years ago, when I was like, this is a load of shit. Like, just to put it simply, this is a load of shit. This isn't the work. And like also recognising the amount of money and like the machine behind this, and knowing people, and again, working with young women from backgrounds that were not dissimilar to where I had grown up and how I had grown up. And so there was that, I'm not doing it like that. There was that. There was frustration in terms of like the tensions between the role that you had within that organisation and the role that I had at the time within the organisation, and just feeling frustrated and feeling really judged and feeling really like, my experience at the time was like, can people just let me do my job? I recognise that this is my role, and I recognise that actually why this role might be problematic in relation to other roles, but actually that's not my business and I just want to do the work. And so I remember that time period. So it was kind of like the frustration that led to me feeling the need to name really directly, right, these are the lines within which I want to work and this is who I am, kind of take it or leave it. But I also think how you met me there, the level of honesty and the level of, just integrity and care that came through that first planning day, I really think challenged me, because I don't know if I was expecting that. I kind of came in being like, right, I'm doing this and I'm doing this anyway. We're going to have this conversation, and like, if like she's either going to take it or she's not, and like that's that.
Yeah,
and
you
like,
were coming in for a fight.
Yeah, I really was. And we're going to talk a bit more about like how race plays into that, because I think that's also a massive part of our relationship we've explored and are exploring. So I came in for a fight, and you didn't give me the fight, because you met me, you heard me, but you also had very, very valid points that I hadn't considered necessarily. So yeah.
Yeah, that's so interesting, isn't it? Yeah, you definitely came in ready for a fight. And I thought, and I remember thinking, well, I've got a choice here. You know, like I can fight her. I'll probably lose, but I could try, or I could hear it, and I could try and understand, and I could try and hear it without defense, and also I think I had a feeling that there was a place we could connect. So maybe I was also like, I had an instinct for our connection, I think. But
and that, for me, I'll segue into race through that, because I think, so there is something about our prototypes, like the depth of connection that we have, the friendship that we have, there is something about our prototypes that just doesn't fit, right? And like on that day, so like, again, going back to the kind of foundations of our relationship, I'm slightly younger than you. And so there is that younger vocal. I was thinking of what's the right word to describe younger Ez. She was vocal. Younger, vocal, black, working class, didn't fit the typical kind of professional mold. Coming into a space, asserting myself in the way that I was. And actually, I think you got frustration because the truth of the matter is, in that particular organisation, there was attempts at me doing it differently with other white women. And I have a thing about white women in the charity sector. Listeners that have listened to me on other podcasts might know. And that prototype that just, there is just no, there is something about like middle class white women, my experience of them then and now being quite disingenuous, fearful of me, unable to see me, unable to connect with me, unable to hear me, but then also working on issues around violence against women and girls, or around issues with women that kind of affect a broad range of women, and how that plays out. So I think there was something about my shock, or not shock, I don't think it was as far as shock, but I was positively challenged by how you didn't fit that stereotype, and how there was something from the very offset, even in terms of what you shared about yourself personally, that I couldn't look at you and see some of that stuff, some of your kind of embodied understandings of how race and racialization plays out in the world, and that's something that I think has been a theme in terms of like how we have learnt from each other, and there is something really grounding about like every time I get to a place in my head of ignorance about white people, white women particularly, there are like a few people in my life that really challenge that and support me to like challenge myself in terms of how I am engaging with whiteness, and particularly white women.
Yeah, and we were talking about it the other day, weren't we, about your power. And you were saying, you know, people are scared of you, or white women are scared of you. And I was like, they find you powerful. And maybe sometimes that translates into them being scared of you. But I think there's something about what white women do face with black female power that is really interesting. And so often that is to kind of shut down, to not engage, to kind of freeze. And I think I was like, oh, who is this person? Because it's true, at that time in the organisation you did have a reputation. And you had a reputation as someone who was strong, who was challenging how things were done, and I was intrigued by that. And I guess I don't know why that was, that I was intrigued by that and didn't feel threatened by it. But I was curious about who you were and what was having, you know, your challenges, because I thought actually they're really, when I heard from you, I was like, they're really valid. And maybe that was also my experience of being around a lot of black women living in the Caribbean and having that, and not being something that was scary for me. Just actually, I welcome that and I'm excited to engage with that difference, that embodied power is something that it fascinates me.
But also I think you carry an embodied power. And so when I think about like the feminist movement, when I think about what it could be, or what it should be, it is women walking in their power. And women taking permission to walk in their power, regardless of what that looks like. And I think when I think about our dynamic, it has always felt like there is space for both of us to walk in our power. There's not like I don't feel that you're challenged by mine and I don't feel challenged by yours. And if and when there are points of tension, it isn't. I think a lot of my experience with white women is that race becomes the thing. So when there are points of tension, it becomes about race, but actually usually there's stuff underneath that. But race becomes the barrier. But I think, I know I don't have that with you. There are a few, I'll be honest, well, maybe one or two other white women in my life that it's a similar experience with, that actually we don't just scapegoat race if there are challenging moments. And I actually don't recall us having challenging moments. But I do know that we're not always, I think there's space for difference. There's space for you to have a view and me to have another view, you to have an experience, me to have another one, which I think just allows us to continue to grow in a way that centres love.
Yeah, and I think when I think back to that first day we spent working together, I think what we did was create space for our difference. As much as I was talking about earlier, like bridging it, it was also space to be in for you to be in your frustration, for me to be in the kind of not understanding of what was happening, to be different. And I think that I was saying to you the other day when we were talking about this conversation, I was saying I felt like we kind of like created a space for our two trees or plants or whatever to grow and their roots to become entwined, but they're separate. There wasn't a sense of like we've got to be aligned, we've got to be the same in any way or somehow negate our differences. There was something about recognizing our difference and connecting through that that I think we found, and that has created a blueprint for our relationship ever since for me.
And like we're talking a lot about the personal I recognise, and I think that listeners will likely be listening from an angle that is even more from an academic space or professional space. And I guess I want to make the link for those that might not be making it themselves, in that I think in order to do this work, so the role of love in social justice work, in order to do this work authentically, in order to do this work sustainably, in order to do this work across difference in a way that isn't harmful, that isn't extractive, there needs to be space for connection and love. There needs to be space to do that, like truly do it. And actually that takes work. So that was the first conversation, which is kind of the springboard for where we are now. But there's been many, many, many more intentional conversations over years and time, and that has only strengthened the work. In fact, we haven't actually worked together in terms of like delivered work together that much. Like we can count the amount of times we've kind of delivered on pieces of work together, but I do know that our relationship definitely strengthens my practice, definitely strengthens my ability to maintain this quote unquote, air quotes again, social justice work that I do outside of this relationship.
Yeah. And it's true that, you know, in that organisation where we were both working at the time, despite all its issues, as you alluded to earlier, there was a prioritisation of connection for people working on delivering projects for young people together, so that we had a day to work together, to plan, to look at who we were in that space. And there's something about what space, what resources do we give to honour the foundations of the work, because as you say, if we're not working from a place of connection, what are we actually doing in the work of in social justice actually, because there's not for me, that ground is so important. That springboard is so integral to the work having any value.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's about the quality of work, right? Because it's not that it's not doable. I've done it. I've done it in ways that I'm not comfortable with. I've done it without the space and time. But the quality of the work is massively affected. And I'm in a place now where I'm fearful. And I recognise that, like, Cosy Lives, austerity, people losing funding, yada, 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 yada. I recognise why. It's not that I can't understand or empathise with why things are looking the way that they are. But I guess I'm yearning to get back to a place where we are prioritising love, care, connection in our practice, and to create so that we can, just so that we can produce high quality work.
And when we were preparing for this conversation, I was sharing where my reflections were at with what love is, and I was saying for me it's about how do I accept all facets of myself, all parts of myself, some of which might feel uncomfortable, might feel shameful, might feel icky, and to acknowledge all of that so I can hold space for and compassion for that in other people. And there's something about that, for me, working from a place of vulnerability, sharing our vulnerabilities like we did in that first day together. There was I felt seen by you. I felt recognised. I felt valued, and I think you felt the same. And there was something about that. It didn't feel comfortable. It didn't feel nice. It didn't feel polite or friendly necessarily. There was a lot of frustration. There was a lot of pain. There was a lot of shame. But it was all there. And there's something about actually being, for me, being real with what's in me, so I can kind of connect with it in you, or with anyone else that I'm working with. That felt important.
And that can only be achieved, in my experience, when people are genuinely curious. Because I think I came in with frustration, but I have something about me. I've had it since I was a little kid. It's like a nosy part, like a genuine curiosity. Like I'm like, ooh. And like there is like a genuine, like I'm intrigued by people. And I think that I see where that creates problems, but I also see where that allows for things to really blossom in some really beautiful ways sometimes. So I think another thing, and I'm going to name this because I think being a black woman in this work, I'm often annoyed and frustrated. It's tempting to lose that curiosity piece. It's really tempting to like, for self-preservation reasons, to just be like, these people are like this, or this sector is like this, or this is going to be like that, and try and navigate my world and my work in that way. And that I see people around me that's their tactic, and I hear it, but there's always a sadness in me, because I'm like, oh, what you are missing out on when you're wrong, even like you might be right 9 times out of 10, but for the one time that you're wrong, where actually this could have been something different. This relationship could really be something different. This person may not be the way that you see the other 9, right? I think there's something about, so yes, I came in with the frustration, but as that day started to unfold and you were sharing of yourself, the genuine curiosity allowed me to hear you back. So it wasn't just about actually me coming to dump my frustrations, but it was also about me being genuinely, a part of me being genuinely open to where you met me and how you responded to that.
And just listening to you makes me think, I wonder if it's both of our appreciation of, or in kind of both of our curiosities that created that bridge, actually. That there was enough in both of us to be like, I'm curious to see what's on the other side of the frustration or the presentation of a white middle class woman, and kind of getting into that. I hadn't thought of that, but I think that's what connected us.
I think so, and I think it's what keeps us connected, because I think that's actually when I think about how we approach, and I want to talk a little bit about Courageous Spaces in a minute, and the work that we're doing together now. But when I think about when I am in story, and what I mean by that is when I'm in a place where I'm telling myself a story rather than in kind of the reality of what's happening, you're very good at challenging that in a way that supports me to be curious again. So I might be like, this thing is like this, and you might see it from a different angle, and you've never been like, no, it's like this. It's more like, oh, I see it like this, or could you look at it like this? And that supports me to get curious again. So it supports me to move past whatever that thing is. And I think my experience of our relationship is that I think that we meet up and we talk, and like we're curious. I'm curious about what's happening in your world. I'm curious about your experiences of this work, of life. And I think there's something about that curiosity that allows us to kind of continue to grow our relationship, particularly in the work that we're doing around race.
When I'm curious, I'm letting go of my judgment, right? Whether that's of myself, whether that's of you, or the situation I find myself in. If I can get curious, then I'm out of my locked kind of binary good, bad, right, wrong, space, and I'm there's an opening. There's something that there's a place of creativity. There's a place of new, maybe unexplored areas. And I think that to me is probably the basis of the work with Courageous Spaces, is how can I get curious about, firstly, my own experience of race and my own experience of racism, and as a white person, my racism in me, and how can I get curious then about the other and about how your experience of race and racism is, and what and coming from that place, as opposed to judgment, stuckness, stillness. There's something about the movement, isn't there, of curiosity?
And there's something coming up for me about the longevity of relationship. So that feels significantly easier to do with you than it does with other people in my world, because it's been practiced over a long period of time. And I think it started somewhat unintentionally, but I think there is a level of intention that we apply. I'll speak for myself. I apply to this relationship that supports that piece to grow. And so again, to make the link between how this fits in with the topic of love and social justice, there is something about time and practice, actually. And like, love is not a fuzzy feeling that you get at first. Like, it's actually, no, love takes time, it takes practice, it takes intention, it takes it's a graft that you keep doing, and it feels great, I think, when you're doing. And there's, in our relationship, it's so easy because you're in that practice. So like I'm meeting somebody that's mirroring my intention, that's mirroring my level of commitment to this. Like it actually makes it really easy. It feels like a shared, like there isn't a burden. It just feels like we're kind of just walking along and we're continuing to pave that path. Whereas I think working with people that don't have that shared commitment to self, to the work, that's where I come against tension, and that's where I find it harder to remain in that place, actually.
And there's something, I was just thinking, the conversation we had earlier this morning about how we ask to be loved, or how we express our needs around how we're loved. And it reminded me of what you said to me the other day, which was, I need you to challenge me more. I mean, those weren't your words, but that was effectively what you were asking me to do. And I came away so grateful that you'd asked me that, and recognising in that I don't challenge you maybe enough, and that I can step into that place of challenge more, and knowing that you really need that and you really value that. And I was just thinking, what a beautiful request, actually, and permission. And I think that playing out in our racial dynamic as well, like what does it mean as a white woman to challenge a black woman, and to do that from a place of love, and to have, you know, explicit permission to do that. And I think part of me has shied, and yeah, I have shied away from stepping into that. And there's just something about how do we express our needs to one another, about what we need from relationship, what we need from a loving relationship, how we need to be loved by the other. And that was just so beautifully done.
And there's two things going on there for me. One, it's taken me a long time to get it. So it's taken me a long time to get to a place where I'm like, I'm going to ask. I'm just going to ask. I'm going to name and I'm going to ask. And I think that's twofold. I think it's one, because the trust is like the level of trust that I have from the place. I trust undoubtedly the place that challenge will come from. I followed it up with and by the way, Katharine, you are going to start to challenge me more, and I am going to push back more because that's my process. I'm not often challenged, and actually a lot of my dynamics don't involve people directly challenging me, particularly in the context of work, maybe more in my personal life. But so there is something about like that, knowing my process, but also trusting you, like really trusting you. And also there's something about recognizing the need, like it isn't equitable if that doesn't happen both ways. And so actually I think that there's something about role, and I'm gonna ask about courageous spaces. I'm going to ask you to kind of flesh out a little bit about, because we've mentioned it, but for listeners, kind of what courageous spaces is, where people can find courageous spaces, and the work that we're doing through that. But yeah, I'm thinking a little bit about like how I think there are layers and levels for me to conversations about race and racism, and I think creating safety is the start. So for people to feel safe enough to tell the truth, and to tell the truth to themselves is often where that starts, about how they feel, what they see, what they're thinking, and for people to create that safety within themselves, and then relationally, if we're going to work together across race, across gender, across different identities, how do we do that in a way where we acknowledge everyone can take up space in that? And then past that point, in order to do that, I think for people that are racialized or for people that are othered or considered to be marginalized, that I'm unapologetic about taking up a lot of space. I say this all the time, that I know I talk a lot. I know that I'm in meetings. I know I'm often one of the loudest in a work context, one of the loudest in the room, one of the most vocal, one of the most demanding. And I recognize the racialized, gendered, classed connotations to who I am doing that. And I've taken no apology in doing that. But then I think beyond that space, beyond representation, I think there's another space of like, what is it to authentically? Because I think often what happens is I take up space or command a room, and actually in doing that doesn't necessarily allow for everybody to be 100% authentically them. It's almost like reversing how power is held. So me being the quote unquote underdog, I've been on a mission to be powerful and to take up space and all of that stuff, which is great. But then something happens where there is a risk of others in that space, and this can happen across racial lines, but it can also happen in terms of just personality. I speak a lot, so actually, if what happens to those people that don't speak as much or that don't communicate in the ways that I do, how are they able to be in relationship and show up authentically too?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you mentioned roles earlier, and you often take on the role of challenger, right? That's a really familiar space to you, and you're really powerful. You're really practiced in that role. So as you say, other people then project their inner challenger onto you. So, I'm not going to challenge because that's what Ez does. You know, subconsciously, of course, that's not people aren't thinking that, but that's going on subconsciously. So I'm often a challenger in spaces I occupy, but you come in and you challenge and I'm like, oh, she's doing the challenging. I don't need to challenge here. So there's something about, whilst yes, you take up space, there's something about for all of us recognizing, oh, who's the challenger in me? And actually just because you're, you know, making yourself heard, being present, fighting for what you believe in doesn't mean that the rest of us negate that part of ourselves. And that's what your request for me did last week. It was like, yeah, I need to step up. I need to step up and meet you there, because it's a lonely place to be otherwise. And I'm denying that part in me. And also I'm denying that in you, actually what you need. And just because you take on that role in spaces doesn't mean you don't need it back. You need it just as much as everyone else does to grow in the work. You're not there, you're not sorted. We're all on a journey with it, and there's something about recognizing that and the complexity that you're not just one thing. You know, that there's all those facets to you as well as there are to everyone else.
That's why I asked you to do it, because you see that, and I wouldn't ask someone that I didn't think saw that. I think there would be so many people, so many white women that would love to love for that, to love to be given explicit permission to challenge me, but I don't necessarily trust that they'd see me wholly. So the place that they're challenging from, I don't necessarily trust, and that's another piece. But yeah, I want to talk a little bit about Courageous Spaces. So tell listeners about Courageous Spaces.
Yeah.
Who are we? What do we do?
So Courageous Spaces is a network of facilitators, coaches, trainers, and we are interested in exploring the impact of race and racism on all our lives. So we're a mixed bunch of folk who gather to explore it first for ourselves and then to support others to explore the impact of race and racism. So, you know, much in line with what we've been talking about this morning, it's really a space to kind of get into the complexities of our experiences. And we do that first from acknowledging my own relationship with race and racism. So we're not an organisation that offers PowerPoint definitions of what it is to be racist or white supremacy or all the rest of it. We are about connection. We're about bringing people together in shared spaces to talk and providing mechanisms for people to have those conversations that we've had, that we started off having and continue to have, but providing spaces where people can have those conversations and connect from a deeper place of personal experience, and, you know, very much in a place of actually everyone's got an experience of race and racism. It's not just for Black people to teach white folk what it is to, you know, what racism is. Actually, what, you know, really exploring what our parts are in this, I suppose, prism that is so often ignored, so often not named, and we're kind of part of what we do as a collective is bringing what's often in the background to the foreground, kind of naming the elephants, multiple elephants in the room, and bringing them out and kind of giving them space. And looking at the feelings, looking at the complexities around the experience of race and racism.
Yeah, and I'm the latest member of Courageous Spaces, so I haven't been involved directly with the work for as long as you and others in the space. But just to kind of share some of my reflections of Courageous Spaces, I think there's something about, so a few things are coming up for me, so I'm going to word vomit here. Hopefully people can keep up. One of those things is that there's something about the importance of intergenerational conversations. So I would say, majority of the trainers in that collective are everyone in the collective is older than me. Majority of trainers in the collective I would consider to be older trainers. I would consider to be elders in terms of this work. And so there's something about the way that, particularly since 2020, race and racism has been discussed in the charity sector. For me, there often lacks like a historical context. So I think people are speaking about race in ways that are no, I was going to lie and say important. I don't. I think people are speaking about ways in race that are very reactive to the context that we're in, ignoring the history of the practice of anti-racist work and practice. And so something that's felt frustrating for me, particularly around like a lot of EDI talk or a lot of like, people that, I basically think that there is a wealth of knowledge in courageous spaces that is untapped in the sector. So that's one thing. I think another thing that, in terms of my experience of courageous spaces, is the approach. So when I think about the social justice world, courageous spaces doesn't engage with necessarily the politics of race and racism. I mean, it does, because you can't engage with race and racism without it being political, but that isn't the entry point, which I think feels really important. And I actually think that the sector could learn a lot from just the place that this collective start their conversations. It's a very, what is the personal, interpersonal, and how does that play out in practice? How does that affect the larger kind of structured systems? So we go looking from the inside out rather than the outside in. And I think there is like a challenge in the space. There's real challenge in the space, but in a way that I think is really strengthening my facilitation, and the way that I'm able to hold conversations about race and racism.
And I think underpinning all of our work is relationship. So is what we've been talking about here, is actually this is about connection, this is about love. And yes, there are challenges, and we are working from a place of love, and that can be really hard. It's not that that's easy and that feels nice, but that's where we come from, and very much from the personal, the inside out approach. And I think we're so, particularly now, there's so many ideas of what it means to be anti-racist, to be, to do the right thing, to say the right thing. And I think actually what we're often missing is the piece of how does it feel in my body? How does it feel? What complex, conflicting thoughts am I having about myself in this experience? And that can go unchecked when we're fixated on the kind of the heady, am I saying this right? Am I using the right terminology here? And it becomes a kind of intellectual experience as opposed to something that is really in our bodies actually, and is really kind of in a space of feelings and thought and judgment and kind of and holding back, and all of those things that have it be much more nuanced, I think, than we'd like to put all the labels on it and make it okay. And it's messy. And I think we embrace the messiness from a place that of deepening relationship. And actually, if we can have these conversations, and they're not safe conversations, you mentioned people feeling safe earlier, but they're not, and people, that's what people want in these conversations. God, tell me it's safe. It's not safe. Especially not safe for black and brown folk to talk about their experience of race and racism. It's not. And what we can create is a space that feels courageous, hence the name. And that's what's needed to have these conversations, but it isn't safe. And I think we have to recognize that and step into it from a place of connection and trust. And it's not to say we can't put things around those conversations to make it, more possible, but we have to step into the discomfort and trust that I will be okay. And it can be uncomfortable.
I really love that. I really love that. I was thinking as you were speaking about just I'm just going to speak very plainly. One of my challenges with how anti-racism work is practiced currently across the sector is I think there is like a yearning for I think people are harm averse basically, or I think people are I think people want to feel nice. Particularly black and brown people, racialized people. I think there is I want to feel nice. And I'm speaking from that perspective. White people, but I think white people always want to feel nice. But I think in this work, in the context of this work, I think, and I get it, I really get it, I really, really get it. I don't want to pretend that I don't get it. I don't want to pretend that I haven't been at different points of my life, career, etc., where that's what I felt I needed. But actually, I don't think I know we can't do it without, it's a minefield. So a couple of bombs are going to go off. And like that, I think the acceptance of that, and when I think about courageous spaces, I think the acceptance of that and the kind of practice in holding that. So it's not being like, bombs go off, we don't care. It's like, bombs go off, and what do we do with that? And how do we limit the bombs that are going to like blow people's limbs off completely? But how do we acknowledge this and do it anyway?
Yeah.
And that feels really unique to the approach, because it and when I spoke about safety, I think it's empowering people to recognize that only they can give themselves that safety, that internal, that I feel able to navigate the world. All of these things are there, but actually I'm empowered to walk through the world, and to build community in that way as well. I think there's something about it not being an individualist, that it's not down to one person but actually to build community in a way that centers love, and that's safe. But that is work, and that is hard, and and harm happens along the way as we're building together.
Yeah, safety is not about avoiding risk. It's not about avoiding difficulty or challenge. I think that's where we're practicing it, and we're practicing it as a collective. You know, we're walking the talk, we're leaning into those moments of challenge. Where does this feel difficult? You know, you made an observation in our last meeting about how white women were around moments of tension in the room, and I was like, God, that's wow. Just it was so uncomfortable, but it was so useful for my learning around how I handle moments of tension, and actually what I'm really holding on to versus what I think I'm holding on to, what I think I'm letting go of. And yeah, that we are practicing that, and it's an untrodden path, I think, in this work. And it's well, I'm not saying it's untrodden in this work. Lots of people have gone before us, but there's something about currently. It feels like there's a a desire to make it clean and nice, and to feel, as you said, for folk to feel nice in this work, and we're not interested in that. So we do repel people for sure. Yeah. Some people are like, oh no thanks, and other people who are up for that challenge and are interested in transformation are like, oh yeah, bring it on. So that feels exciting.
Before I move into the closing question, where can people find Courageous Spaces?
So we have a website, which is courageousspaces.co.uk, and we are also on LinkedIn. So Courageous Spaces, I think that's it. We're on, Courageous Spaces on LinkedIn.
Brilliant, thanks. And moving into the closing question. So what is the role of love in social justice work?
The role of love in social justice work. The role of love in social justice work is, for me, fundamental. It's about connection, and it's about acceptance. It's about being us in our complexities and our differences, not trying to make us the same, but about giving space to what exists in ourselves and in the other, and coming from a place of curiosity. I think that's become really clear in our conversation this morning. The role of love is about curiosity, and it feels fundamental to me.
Thank you, Katharine. Thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you for listening to Surviving Society.
To support our work, you can rate,
review and subscribe. To host or produce a series of Surviving Society,
get in touch with us via Twitter or Instagram.